Good evening, everyone. My name is Kim Dorman, and I serve as the Community Engagement Coordinator for the Princeton Public Library. We are back in person, continuing conversations on race and white privilege. It's a monthly program that we put on in collaboration with Not in Our Town, Princeton. The program meets on the first Monday of every month, except when there's a holiday, and then either we meet on the following Monday or the Tuesday, but you can check our calendar always or the Not in Our Town website, Not in Our Town Princeton website, to see what the dates are and what the month's topic will be. Today we are multi-platform, and I'm here with Becky Bowers, who's our wonderful technology manager, who's making sure that despite all things, everything will go smoothly this evening, and so we're delighted to have her helping out this evening. This room is T-Coil enabled. We ask everybody who's speaking to use a microphone. It makes people easier to understand and easier to hear, whether you're using a T-Coil enabled device or not. And anyone who's coming in through the computer does not need to use a microphone because you're already in the system. So Joyce and Amy, not to worry. Introducing this evening's program is the wonderful Caroline Clark, a board member of Not in Our Town, Princeton. Caroline.
Joyce goes here.
Oh, I lied. I didn't lie. Caroline will be introducing the program, but before Caroline introduces the program, Joyce Trotman-Jordan is going to read the land acknowledgement and also the mission statement of Not in Our Town, Princeton. On to Joyce.
You got it. The land on which we are living is part of the ancient homeland and traditional territory of the Lenni Lenape people. We pay respect to the Lenni Lenape people, past, present, and future, and their continuing presence in their homeland and in the diaspora. We also acknowledge the millions of enslaved Africans and their descendants on whose backs the wealth of this nation was created. Not in Our Town, Princeton is a multiracial, multi-faith group of individuals who stand together for racial justice and inclusive communities. Our focus is to promote the equitable treatment of all and to uncover and confront white supremacy, the system that facilitates the preference, privilege, and power of white people at the expense of non-white people and pits racial groups against each other by upholding hierarchies based on proximity to whiteness. Our goal is to identify and expose the political, economic, and cultural systems which have enabled white supremacy to flourish and to create new structures and policies which will ensure equity and inclusion for all. In our commitment to uncovering the blight of white supremacy on our humanity, we take responsibility to address it and to eliminate it in all its forms through intentional actions, starting with ourselves and our communities.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. You can take the slideshow down now. Because there's going to be some.
Thank you, Joyce.
Are you speaking to my? Okay.
Am I?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Am I enabled?
You should be. Go ahead. Just talk.
Okay. Good evening, continuing conversationalists. It's good to see you all. Welcome back. And welcome to first timers. Welcome to all the in-person people. Tonight's speaker is Amy Torres, the Executive Director of New Jersey Alliance for Immigrant Justice. In this position, they lead member organizations and staff to direct policy and organizational priorities. Prior to NJAIJ, Torres served for over 7 years in immigrants' rights and policy advocacy in New York City with a focus on Asian American and Pacific Islander empowerment. Torres brings depths of experience in coalition building, civic engagement, and from their personal life, grassroots organizing in Hudson County. Firmly rooted in Torres's identity is their experience as a second-generation Filipinx American and the core belief that the human rights and liberties should not be subject to change because of something as arbitrary as birthplace, border, or paperwork. Tonight, Torres will discuss the racial disparities in the treatment of immigrants. Welcome, Amy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for the very warm welcome and the kind introduction. I'm really excited for tonight's conversation and to just get a quick sense of who's in the room with us. I can see some names on the Zoom screen. Really great to see some folks. Really happy to be joined by folks in the room that I cannot yet see. But do we think it would be possible to, let's see, I think given the number of folks in Zoom, why don't we, oh, thank you. Oh, great. Hi, everyone. Very nice to see you all. All right, why don't we start this way? I invite you to turn to someone next to you if you're in person, and otherwise, if you are in chat, to please introduce your name, your pronouns, and what does immigrant justice mean to you? It doesn't have to be a long paragraph. If you can try and get it in like 3 to 5 words. What does fighting for immigrant justice mean for you?
What happens? You guys are gonna be.
Yes, we're part.
What is immigrant justice? Oh, my pronouns are she, her.
My pronouns, she and her. She and her.
Do you identify? You identify?
And are the virtual participants able to use chat? Oh, I think so. Yeah, great. Thanks, everyone.
What is immigrant justice? Gosh, I don't do.
All right, we're going to give it another minute or so for folks who are still using the chat. And while you're writing your responses out, I'm just going to name some of the great things that folks mentioned. Someone said borders are man-made, so human rights for all. Making sure anyone who comes to America is treated humanely and has a fair chance. That's wonderful. Treating them like human beings and full protection from harm that the law allows for citizens. This is really great. Immigrant justice means kindness. Love this. Great. Wonderful. All right, could I ask maybe 2 people from our live audience and 2 folks from our virtual audience to share maybe what you discussed with a partner or in your own words, something that you shared in chat? We can start with our library audience first.
You want to go? Sure, happy to. People talk about this nation being built by immigrants, and immigrant contributions are absolutely have been critical. At the same time, there were people who were brought here unwillingly and contributed their labor, uncompensated labor. So for me, the immigrant justice has to me, the immigrant justice is part of justice, a larger picture of justice, where where labor is compensated the way it should be, equitably, that the support that is needed for whomever in the society needs it is available. Thank you, Linda. Thank you.
Do you want to take someone from the online audience now, Amy?
Sure, let's see. I'm scrolling through the list. It looks like we have a lot of folks with the first name, first letter K. Would anyone with letter K like to come off mute and share your reflection?
One of those is me, so no. Yeah, let her do that.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, looks like Kathleen. Kathleen, go ahead. Unmute and speak.
My reflection was that we should treat all immigrants as our neighbors and help them in any way that they request to integrate into our communities and provide assistance to do that.
Thank you, Kathleen. Great. Well, I appreciate everyone sharing so much. I also appreciate everyone's flexibility with sharing across the virtual and in-person space. I regret that I wasn't able to join in person today. I'm not great at driving in stormy weather, and looking at the forecast was a little bit nerve-wracking to me today. So since I'm not able to come in person, I am going to share screen for a little bit just to help facilitate our discussion and help it be a little more lively for us together. So if you give me just a moment to do that, then I will open it up. Here we go. All right. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Awesome. All right. So I want to cover a few different things today. First, we'll talk a little bit more about the Alliance, how you can get involved in our work if that's something that you're interested in. We'll talk about that stuff that many of you already uncovered in the icebreaker about what exactly is immigrant justice. And it's absolutely worth saying that there's no immigrant justice without Black justice. Immigrant justice is a racial justice issue. There must be an intersectional and cross-movement fight. Oh, you know what? Am I sharing the right one? Are we seeing one that says land acknowledgement now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, I have two screens going. So it's really important to recognize that immigrant justice is not a lone fight, which also means that there are not silver bullet solutions. So we'll talk about that. And then I also want to share a little bit about how New Jersey has positioned itself in the forefront of the larger immigration fight nationally. Immigration is a topic that is now unavoidable in our national election cycles, but New Jersey has made some really incredible progress in large, by and large, due to the work of organizations and individuals on the ground that have been fighting for social and racial justice campaigns. And then we'll end with just some ways to get involved and stay connected. We have some events coming up later this month. We'd love to see you at them. So I know that, and I'm grateful that we had a land acknowledgement to start. You know, we think it's really important to also recognize that land and border is a definition that has changed always, and that often these definitions are in the power of the colonizer, and that in order for us to really fight for immigrant justice, fight at the intersection of racial justice, we need to acknowledge not just original lands that we are on, but also acknowledge the long struggle of people who have fought against these definitions. So as you take a look at this map, if you could just consider, you know, in addition to the words we shared earlier, considering your own role in decolonization. We also, each of us play a role in upholding or challenging white supremacy. So if we could take just a few moments to sit with that and reflect on that together. Okay, thank you for joining me in that. To say a little bit more about the Alliance, again, appreciate the great introduction. We are a membership coalition. Currently, our coalition spans over 50 different organizations from every corner of the state. That can be, you know, big name groups like ACLU, New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, New Jersey Policy Perspective, but it's also made up of grassroots organizations. It's folks that meet in church basements, who close down the bodega and meet there late at night. We're grassroots, grass tops organizations fighting together for policies that empower immigrants. If this is something that you would like to get involved in, we'll say more about that later. But it's really important to recognize that many of the wins that we've secured in New Jersey were not alone. So even though you might see the Alliance show up at different places, really we are a placeholder for a larger network and coalition that comes together to fight for these causes. So to kick us off, I want to start with the question, what is immigration? And we have two pictures on the screen. One is from a time when pictures couldn't be taken, but it's a placeholder for a picture. And then one picture that's quite close to home, Ellis Island. When we say the word immigration, and I saw in chat, you know, everyone is an immigrant, or, you know, we've all had migration stories. I think it's important to recognize that while many of us may have immigration experiences or may have migration experiences, it is not always the same as the types of immigration policy that this nation was founded on, which is largely to exploit labor, or to force labor in many cases. I mean, there's ways of talking about immigration that recognize forcible migration, but also we cannot say that immigration is the same as forced enslavement. But when you think about immigration and what it means to your family, could I get a quick show of hands? You can either use the Zoom function to raise your hand, or in the audience, I'm able to see you too. You can raise your hand. Your migration story, if your family has one, if it is from the last 50 years, if you could please raise your hand. And I'm going to stop sharing screen just so that we can see each other on the, of course I can't stop now. Here we go. Okay, so if you could raise your hand if your family's immigration story was within the last 50 years. All right, so I have about 4 people who are tuning in on Zoom. Looks like 1 or 2 people in the audience. Could you raise your hand if your family's migration story is within the last 100 years? All right, seeing a few people. Great. Does anyone have family who immigrated over 150 years ago? Great. Wow, so lucky to trace your lineage so far. Anyone who has family lineage dating back to the founding of the United States or over 200 years ago? Wow, I see. Yeah, okay, great. I see some hands up in the audience. Okay, great. Thank you so much for sharing that. So to go back here, I think it's really important when we talk about immigration to recognize that depending on when our families migrated or when they came here, immigration policy was quite different. Have folks been to Ellis Island before? You can just give me a quick yes, no. Sorry, trying to see the chat at the same time. So at Ellis Island, if that's a place that your family emigrated to, there's a place where you can look up paperwork based on, you know, whatever ship your family member came in on. And I think in the American consciousness, we sort of think that Ellis Island was like the place for the first time that immigrants came to the United States, but that's simply not true. Much of the ideas that we have around border, even the term immigrant, and even the concept of whiteness have been forged not to welcome new people in, but rather to exclude and further define what is truly American. So there was, up until 1921, no border across the southern border. There was no marking at all that demarcated where, you know, Mexico began and the United States began. If families came through Ellis Island, you did not need visa sponsorship, you didn't need an employer to sponsor you, you didn't need to prove that other family members were here. All you needed to come to the United States was to be able to pay your fare on whatever boat was taking you here. And immigrants have been, of course, coming to the US for long before Ellis Island. I think at times Ellis Island is sort of used as this symbol of what the right type of immigration looks like. But I think it's really important to recognize that many of the folks that came through Ellis Island were immigrants who later got adapted into white identities. So Irish Catholics, Italian Americans, but folks from Asia, from Latin America, were coming to the US long before then. And indeed, some of the definitions that we have today about citizenship were litigated against Asian immigrants who were trying to claim the rights that they felt belonged to them as Americans. So citizenship was something that was litigated against a South Asian immigrant who wanted to claim his right to land ownership. And it was only then that the courts decided, what does it truly mean to be a white person? Even our laws around interracial marriage, you know, for a very long time, up until the 50s, I think, which is very recent in time, white women who married immigrants were at risk of giving up their citizenship. So if you were a US citizen white woman who chose to marry someone who is non-white and not non-citizen, you basically were pledging your allegiance to another nation, which meant your citizenship, your US citizenship came into question. So many of these ideas that we have today about immigration actually have like many hundreds of years of ideologies that go into them. So when we're talking about things like Governor Abbott's floating border wall with razor wire, we're really talking about, you know, the end game of centuries of dehumanizing and othering and making migration be something that is in the American mindset required to be costly and required to be deadly. So I want to talk a little bit next about where we are with immigration over the last 2 to 3 years. I think, again, it's become an issue that is unavoidable in the national election cycle. Would anyone like to take a guess at when was the last time that Congress considered a bipartisan comprehensive immigration plan? What year was it that we really had a chance of passing bipartisan immigration reform? Someone said 1982. Someone in chat said during the Bush years.
I was thinking during the Bush years. Yeah, between George and W. Bush.
So the most recent time that we had an immigration package that was really, truly likely to pass was August 2001. It was, yes, and I'm seeing now in chat, it was under President George W. Bush. If you remember that election, he had campaigned as a Texas governor who knew about the contributions of immigrants to the state of Texas. And he used that to forge a immigration reform plan that had huge support in both parties, was on the cusp of, it had just been introduced. It was on the cusp of being pushed through Congress. And then, if we're thinking about August 2001, September 2001 was not very far away. And then the US swung back into this incredibly nativist, nationalist, xenophobic, and deeply Islamophobic mindset. And that deal just completely fizzled. And then it was within a few years' time that we then we got rid of the Immigration Naturalization Services and formed it into the Department of Homeland Security, which is now the agency and the department that controls immigration. So I say all of this because I think at times folks that work in the immigrant justice space, we're used to hearing the words, well, my family came here the right way, right? Or, people say we shouldn't use the word illegal, but if you're breaking the law, that's illegal. But I think that calls into question, what is the right way? If laws are changing all the time, and if laws are constantly reactive to public opinion and public pressure, or this preservation of a white American identity, then what is the worth in a law? And are those laws actually ones that we want to continue? Or do we need to think about immigration beyond ideas like borders and quotas and visas and things like that? So over the last 2 or 3 years, immigration, I guess it's hard to pinpoint a time where things became very seemingly dire in the immigration conversation space. Of course, folks remember in that winter of 2017, turning up at airports to protest the Trump administration's Muslim ban. By 2018, there were those widely publicized pictures of family separation at the border. But I think one thing that we miss as a movement is how things shifted under the Biden administration, and how many of the horrors and atrocities that people cared deeply about during the Trump years are still continuing under the Biden administration, but almost under a different, there's a different optics and media strategy around it. So the Biden administration in many ways continued to litigate in defense of Title 42 once Title 42 ended. The Biden administration has proposed and is using, up until last week, new asylum definitions that in many ways are harsher than the Trump administration's asylum definitions. We also know that the Biden administration has relied heavily on private immigration detention. These are private prison corporations that have very little transparency, very little public accountability, even though the Biden administration ended private prison agreements for corrections facilities, federal correction facilities, that hasn't extended to immigration detention facilities. And now the Biden administration has a larger percentage of immigrants in detention under private prison contracts than under the Trump administration. And that number especially continues to grow because we were at some lows at the end of the Trump administration due to the pandemic. One other thing that the Biden administration has done, I think, particularly well, and I say well in a like in a tricky way, like that they've managed that very well, is that there's been this reliance on what they term alternatives to detention, and there's been an over-reliance and overuse of surveillance technologies. So biometric information is now captured at the border. And this is something that, you know, has become part and parcel of the immigration experience. But if anyone has traveled recently, you may notice that it's something that has just creeped into the regular routine of travelers, regardless of whether you're crossing a border or not. So recently I was at Newark Airport, and they have facial scanners for walking into the security area rather than having an agent there to review you. So, you know, there's a lot of ways in which this surveillance creep is growing. And because things like, I'm blanking on the word, the agency that's airport security.
TSA.
Yes, TSA. Because TSA falls under DHS, this is a huge database of information that's just being like collected without any oversight, and also without any sort of like notice or real clear ability to opt out on the public's behalf. So there's real concerns about how these departments and agencies are growing and growing their reach, and it's sort of outside of public view. It's not as splashy as, you know, families in Mylar blankets, but it is also as bad and has as devastating consequences. And we, of course, saw those consequences, you know, even if this audience aside, you know, even if someone does not care about immigration or think immigration policy is something that doesn't affect them, we saw that these types of policies do affect the general public, because in 2020, when there were major protests all across the nation after the murder of George Floyd, CBP and ICE were able to exercise jurisdiction in places that were within the 100-mile border zone. Could I get a quick nod of heads or thumbs up if folks have heard about the 100-mile border zone?
No.
Okay. So you may be surprised to know that the entire state of New Jersey falls within the border zone. When DHS and ICE and CBP were created, they were given these broad jurisdictions along the border, but at the time, there wasn't really a set definition of what the border is and what the border zone is. So the border zone is now defined as 100 miles within all of the coastal borders of the United States, coastal and land borders of the United States. So that's both the southern border and the northern border, as well as the coast, 100 miles inward, as well as 100 miles of any international airport, because those are also considered border crossing points. So we saw in Seattle that ICE and CBP were deployed using facial recognition technology to surveil protesters, to pursue arrest. And these were outside of the local police jurisdictions and the state police jurisdictions. And there are states like New Jersey, Florida, you know, there's a few of the smaller states. I think most of California, the entire state falls within that 100-mile zone. So constitutional rights can be suspended if the federal government deems there to be an emergency that warrants or affects national homeland security. So these are all like really terrible things that like continue to persist across administrations, regardless of which party is in power. And I think having a lens that understands understands the ways in which these policies continue, even when they're not within media view, is really important. So next, I want to just pull out how we at the Alliance think about immigrant rights versus immigrant justice. So we opened tonight's conversation talking about immigrant justice. I think often we talk about this in the framework of like more rights and protections for immigrants, but really what we're trying to do is right size some of the systemic and structural inequalities that exist in this nation. So again, calling into question notions of things like border, identity, even workplace authorization, you know, why are those things that are necessary, and thinking about justice as, again, something that we're pursuing, not just in terms of equality, but also equity and what is owed to communities that have been systemically harmed by years and years and years of racist immigration policy. So the Alliance fights for a few different key issues. I want to walk through next some of the ways in which states have taken up local fights to fight back against federal immigration policy, because even as much as it may seem sometimes like we're sitting ducks, you know, waiting for DACA to expire or waiting for, you know, some new directive about asylum or refugee policy, there's actually a lot that states can do to take up the fight against regressive federal policy change. So in the Bush era, there was, of course, the creation of DHS, you know, widespread discrimination, bias and surveillance of Muslim communities all across the nation, especially here in New Jersey. And there were lots of grassroots fights to, one, push back against the formation of DHS itself, but also extend definitions of discrimination and bias for Muslim and South African communities. This was a conversation that had not been had at a national scale in the same way, but there were a lot of efforts, and I'll say more about this in a bit, to make sure that there was visibility for these communities and that they're, you know, not monolithic, and that even the diversity within our communities often gets rendered invisible, which again leads us vulnerable to discrimination and bias. During the Obama administration, you know, folks of course remember the push for DACA. Prior to it being the push for DACA, it was supposed to be a push for bipartisan immigration reform, but largely in reaction to the Affordable Care Act, there was just this sort of idea that nothing else could get done. So there were a lot of concessions made to the Dreamer plan, and instead DACA became the concession piece, which permitted young people who had immigrated with their families to secure work permits, but it never was a means toward citizenship. So even if you secured DACA, there was basically no way to get off of DACA to attain citizenship without some other way of, you know, marrying someone or some other form. But DACA was never enough. And even attempts to expand DACA to include parents were blocked. President Obama also was, prior to the last two presidents, known as the deporter in chief. So deportations really ramped up under the Obama administration. And this is something that I think, again, sort of flew under the media radar, but that immigrant justice advocates knew very well. And this really set up the stage for many of the fights that happened under the next administration, particularly around sanctuary cities. Sanctuary cities and states have it's worth saying there's no definition that defines what a sanctuary policy is, but anything that welcomes immigrants or expands services for immigrants is deemed a sanctuary policy. It's worth noting that in 2017, New Jersey was the first state to be sued by the Trump administration for our sanctuary policy. The Attorney General's office issued the Immigrant Trust Directive, which severed agreements between local law enforcement and immigration enforcement and banned the use of 287G agreements. This faced some lawsuits by counties in New Jersey, but it also faced a lawsuit from the Trump administration. And this was the first time that they brought a suit against a state. So I'll say more about that in a little bit, because it won't be the first time that New Jersey has been sued for our immigration policies. But it did put us on the map as a state that was, willing to be very aggressive and very forward in limiting our participation in the federal deportation and detention machine. And then lastly, under the Biden administration, we know many of the same border policies continued. Conversations around citizenship packages have completely stalled and fallen apart, but New Jersey's made really amazing progress in the last 3 to 4 years. We were able to pass a driver's licenses for all bill, which was huge. It went into effect in 2021, which allows people to have licenses. This is so important just from, basic access and like movement throughout the state, seeking employment, seeking other opportunities. But really importantly, it also protects communities who may otherwise be found without identity and then just be arrested simply for not being able to prove their identity. New Jersey also banned ICE detention contracts. I'll say more about this in a little bit. And as a result of this ban, all 3 of the county jails backed out of their existing operations due to the political pressure that was brewing on the ground. New Jersey has also expanded healthcare coverage, state Medicaid coverage to children in undocumented families and undocumented children. And we passed a first of its kind direct payment program for families excluded from pandemic aid. So there's been a lot of progress. These are just a few of the many hallmarks of the last few years. But it's important to remember that a lot of this work actually stems from early years of people talking about the unfairness and the cruelty of our immigration system, so that we can get to a place where we can start having conversations in Trenton about the need for more welcoming and inclusive policies. All right, so, whoops. The fight for immigrant justice has been wide and far-reaching. We do have a few campaigns that we would love your feedback and support and involvement in. The first is a language access bill that we are supporting. So it may surprise you to know, it surprised me when I first found out that New Jersey is number 2 in our state's share of immigrants. So often people say, oh, immigration states, that's places like Arizona, New York, California, Florida, Texas. It's actually New Jersey that's number 2. As a proportion to our total population, we have the second highest number of immigrants. And we're also one of the most language diverse states in the nation. Over 155 languages are spoken in New Jersey. There's a bill that passed the Senate this spring that would require state agencies to provide translation and interpretation in top languages all across the state. And the bill has unfortunately stalled in the assembly, but we really think that this is a possible win. And so in a moment, I'll have a place for you to take action if that's something that you would like to support. The other bill that we're supporting is a data disaggregation bill. This is my least favorite bill to explain because the name is so difficult to understand, but essentially what it is a data equity bill. There are state agencies that capture demographic information as part of the application for particular services or intake forms, but it doesn't separate identities for Asian American and Pacific Islander communities, nor Middle East and North African communities. So often these communities are lumped under just the category Asian, or for Middle East and North African communities, they're lumped together under white. So this causes a lot of issues when we're trying to fight for visibility for our communities, when we're talking about disparities. It's really hard to highlight this data because we're sort of flattened into these two category boxes and not able to highlight the diverse needs within these communities. And then the final bill that we're supporting is something called the Values Act, which would make that Immigrant Trust Directive that I spoke about earlier permanent, and would also expand it to provide protections at places like libraries, shelters, food banks. Right now, if a school security officer asks a parent who came for a PTA meeting to show ID, and that parent can't show ID, there's nothing that stops that school security officer from calling ICE and saying, hey, I think this person is illegal. It sounds abhorrent and it's wrong, but there's also no law stopping that from happening. And indeed, it does happen. It happens when people enroll into health programs. It happens when they show up for programs and services that they're entitled to. And so the Values Act would limit those interactions and provide protection so that that's not happening. I'm going to move to this slide, which will show you a larger QR code. And so if you have your phone on you, you can take your phone and scan this QR code. I'm also going to drop into chat the link where you can take action if that's easier. So if QR code is not your favorite form of doing things.
I don't know if I can actually make it bigger.
All right, and then while folks are taking action, I did want to do a short pause for questions before I share some upcoming events and actions that we have. While we're doing the questions, I'm going to leave my screen open just so folks can continue to access the QR code. But when it comes time to share events, I'll come off screen so we can see each other's faces more clearly. But I'd love to, I know we covered quite a bit. If there are questions, reactions, reflections, things that came up for you.
Caroline has her hand. I have a question.
Yeah. Where's the microphone?
We have one in person. We're just grabbing the mic.
Sure.
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you. Thank you for all the information. I have, I think the people in this room who know me know that I have often held the position that the immigration system actually works the way it was designed to work, right? It is just one of our systems, and all of them are designed to continue the status quo and to continue to racialize America, and immigration is one of them. So I say that with even more confidence after the Ukraine conflict.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, when Ukraine went to war, I saw the Ukrainians in Ukraine say that the African immigrants there could not get on the train to get to freedom. But the white Ukrainians who were allowed to get on that train and to get freedom They came right here and we welcomed them with open arms. And asylum systems worked just fine for the Ukrainians. Assimilation worked, services worked, and those people were welcomed. However, I am stunned at how we all sat back and said, well, we should help the Ukrainians. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't, but we don't draw a sharp contrast to what happens to the brown and black people at the borders, right? So with the Ukrainians, there were no borders, okay? And they were outright racist, even about escaping war. And we still with open arms, we welcome them. I don't hear anybody talking about them taking our jobs, them overcrowding our schools. I don't hear any of that. So I take the position that immigration works the way that it was designed to work, and it's working just fine. The problem is racism in America, and anti-Black racism is the strongest sentiment. The higher up on the caste you go, the more rights and benefits you have. In fact, when you talk about disaggregating data, it is only in the Black community where Black immigrants are actually treated better than ADOS.
Mm.
And so I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Can you define ADOS?
Oh, I apologize. American descendants of slaves.
American descendants what?
From slaves.
Of slaves.
Slaves.
It's so
Thank you.
important. Yes, yeah, I really want to, it's worth repeating is that we think about, we're told, right, we're through the American public education system, we're told that immigration policy was more permissive, but that's not, you're exactly right, that's not actually the case. We put policies in place as a means of excluding, right? And we saw that exactly with Ukrainian refugees at the same time that we were dealing with a refugee crisis coming out of Afghanistan. And yet we were able to mobilize just like these incredible resources, these like work authorization policies for Ukrainian refugees. And, you know, you want to tell us that after decades of war on Afghanistan, that like we weren't able to prepare and that we're not able to like adjust the status of refugees coming from Afghanistan. So it's absolutely, you're absolutely correct. And it's worth us naming out loud as often as we can, because as soon as you do, you see how false the narrative is, and what has been sold to us is not true at all. I see Judith in the chat has a question. How would New Jersey handle the humanitarian immigrant crisis in New York? This is a great question, Judith. And first, let me say that there is no migration crisis. There's a housing crisis, and there's a resources crisis that has existed in our communities for like a very, very, very long time. Much of where to start. So what I will say is that people who have been bused or lured to New York or Philadelphia or other sanctuary cities, their first stop may have been those places, but their second and final stop often is New Jersey. We've been working pretty closely with the city of Newark. Others have been working across the state, cities like Elizabeth, Patterson. There are growing communities of newly arrived folks who are in need of resources and support that our systems are already broken beyond repair to fix. So we've been active in the conversation. I think the question is not how do states solve this issue, but the question is how do we provide pressure on the federal government to get them to act on behalf of people who are seeking asylum, people who are seeking safety, just as I'm sorry, I forgot your name, the person who spoke earlier from within the library audience, but as Dawn?
Caroline.
Caroline. As Caroline was saying, you know, we know that it's possible to change policies for people. We did it when there was a crisis in Ukraine. Why can't we do it in a just status for folks that need it now? And so I think there's an opportunity for us to do some like federal engagement. And I know just today, a group of organizations from New York sent a letter to Secretary Mayorkas saying that work authorization needed to be expedited for these communities so that they could become, you know, self-sustainable. I think it's also a manufactured crisis, right? It's a housing crisis, it's a resources crisis, it's all these other things, but it's also that if you are here and you're planning to file for asylum, if you start working, you are going to ruin your asylum case because you aren't given authorization to work. So the system forces you to break the law in order to like try and stay compliant with the law. So I know that's not an answer, Judith, but that's just what's going on with folks arriving here. I think the last thing that I'll say is, you know, if there are, I have a friend who, she lives in a place where they're considering building a new development that would have affordable housing. There's also another new development being considered in her town for a shelter, and it's facing all of this backlash in her town. And she's really surprised because it's the same kind of town that has like those, we believe in Black Lives Matter, we believe blah, 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 blah. And she's like, yet all of these people are coming up and talking about how it's going to like ruin the character of the neighborhood. And, you know, if you care about immigrant justice, you care about expanding shelter services, you care about, you know, not giving tax breaks to real estate developers. So yeah, there are whole systems, and there's not going to be a silver bullet. You know, even work authorization is not going to solve the crisis that we're seeing now. There's like whole systems that are stacked against each other. All right, so I welcome more questions as they come up. I do want to share a couple calls to action. So let me exit out of this so that we can see each other better. All right, so I mentioned that one of the things that New Jersey had fought for was a ban on immigration detention. 3 of the county jails have ended their operations, but there is still a private facility in operation, the Elizabeth Detention Center, that is set to expire at the end of this month. However, in February of this year, the private prison corporation Core Civic filed a lawsuit challenging the New Jersey ban on immigration detention, claiming that they want to extend the length of their contract and that the law hurts their profits, and that they want the portion of the law that bans private agreements to be stricken down. The Biden administration, since that lawsuit was filed in February, has since joined in support of the private prison corporation. So yet again, we have a federal administration filing a lawsuit against a New Jersey sanctuary policy. There's a hearing to determine whether there should be a restraining order or a temporary injunction put in place that would temporarily suspend this part of the law while the case continues to determine what happens longer term. And that is going to happen Monday in Trenton. Several immigration groups from across the state are planning to gather in Trenton to pack the court. Packing the court is a protest tactic that has happened many, many times in the past. Essentially, what we do is we show up. It's a federal courthouse, so there's no actual protesting. It's more of like silent protest and strength in numbers. And we make sure to pack the observation benches so that we can watch the proceedings and ultimately see what the judge will rule. There will also be a demonstration outside. So there will be a rally and a press conference happening outside, because I don't think all of us are going to be able to fit into the courthouse. If that's something that you're interested in, I'll drop a link shortly about how to get involved. On August 20th, we're also doing a rally and demonstration outside of the Elizabeth Detention Center itself. So the detention ban went into effect, excuse me, in August of 2021. So we gather on the anniversary each year to celebrate that win, but also to call for the Elizabeth Detention Center to close. We'll be calling again for that August 20th. And then finally, at the end of the month, we are hosting a full moon healing circle where we are going to use the full moon on August 31st to set our intentions to kick ICE out of New Jersey. By this point, we'll have been protesting quite a bit throughout the month. So we want this to be a healing space and a community building space. And I'll share more information about that in the chat as well. All right, I'm seeing some messages come up. Let me just make sure. Oh, okay. I'm sorry, Kim. I'm seeing your message in chat. I can pass it back to you.
That's
For
okay.
Rooms.
Yeah, no, wonderful. It's wonderful. You know, there was a lot of people saying, oh, I didn't know that, and shock and surprise. And I got notices saying, I wish there was a disgusted emoji for a lot of the things that you were saying. So thank you. I don't know, Linda or Caroline, if you want to say anything in between to thank Amy or to before we go into the breakout rooms.
I would like to read the community.
Yes, thank you. We'll put them up too.
Yes, yes.
Thank you, Amy. Amy.